So we're going to do two things. First part of the class, as long as it takes, I want to show you just a few small changes I made to the page on the final exam. More importantly, I would like to review quickly the basics of the exam, of the project, sorry, the final project. We can talk about the exam as well, but I want to review the basics of the final project and answer any questions you have, whether you've tried to work on this or are still dreading the moment you will have to do this. We can talk about the oral presentation, anything else, and we can go back and I can answer more questions in the weeks to come, but this is the right time to review everything together with you. Once we're done with that part, we're going to watch more scenes from Le Mans, but I also want to provide a different way to look at the contents and the characters of the film. Okay? So keep in mind, everything you need to know about the final project is inside this page called Format and Methodology of the Final Project, and you find links to it almost everywhere in the wiki. In here, there are plenty of suggestions, different ways to look at the project, but the most important sections for this page are the following. First, the primary sources. Once again, when you think of the final project, the basics are you need 3 short stories, unless you have 2 that are so long and complex that 2 short stories would be enough. But I would recommend that you submit the stories you've picked to me to make sure that you're doing it correctly. The default, the standard amount would be 3 stories on the automobile. However, these stories to be included in the project are not any short story you can find in a library or by using Google. They have to come from specific sources which are chronologically and thematically aligned with the class. So the sources that you find in here are mostly sources from the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And they're magazines from the period that often included short stories for their readers. And some of those stories, of course, since the automobile was a popular product and there were a lot of fictional stories than films about the automobile, some of those short stories are important enough to understand the representation of the automobile. So in here you find, for example, Harper's Bazaar and Magazine, then you find Life, Mansis Magazine, Scribner, Cosmopolitan, and under each section, right, let's say for Harper's Magazine, you're provided a link. Whenever possible, I used Avi Trust rather than Google because this is a digital corpus handled professionally, whereas Google Books, it's a different story. They're still trying to redirect you. They might hide what they have from you. It's not the best thing to use in a serious fashion. Of course, as you can see in here, let me make this a little larger. When I get to Avi Trust for this particular magazine, I find different collections of issues, and I provided instructions, but clearly you just skipped over the 19th century issues of the magazines before the invention of the automobile, and even later it would be difficult to find the short stories from the 1890s. It would take a lot of time. So you go straight to 1903, 1904, 1907. Remember what I told you in class last time, how 1906 through 1908 are really the peak of the automobile and the peak of the effort to market the automobile as a global product. So you find an explosion of documents, including short stories, devoted to the automobile. And once you found one that you would like to work on, then it's up to you. You open this and you can either just flip through the pages, looking at the titles. Of course, you also find index tables of contents, so you can just go through the titles to see if, let's say, the turn of the wheel, a story. Is this a reference to the automobile or the turning of the wheel of time, right? There are different ways to find short stories. One is just by going through the pages. The other, of course, is using the search box and putting there motor car, automobile, car, looking at the results to see if any of the passages where the keyword is found promises to be from a short story, okay? You don't have to work just on one of these magazines or all of them. You can just look at any of them, see how comfortable you are with the material, with the process of trying to find a short story. However, as I said in class, you don't have to worry too much about that. It depends on how comfortable you are with this process. Otherwise, you can also, within the same page for the final exam, go to a section called Examples. In here, you find example number 1, which is the one I used to demonstrate the process in class. So stay away from number 1. It's done. It's done to death because I've provided plenty of notes about it. However, I added more, and at this point, you find 2 through 7, you find 6 more short stories, and you're welcome to use up to 2 of those short stories. In fact, you could even take all 3 of your stories from this list. But if you want an A, if you want to demonstrate your full understanding of the concepts of the class, try to find at least 1 story on your own within the sources that are linked in here. As I repeated several times, if you're not sure whether something you found is good enough to be included in the project, you can do what some of the students have already done. You can send me a link or multiple links via email asking me to review those documents and provide feedback, meaning are they good enough for the project, or are they borderline, or are they irrelevant? And otherwise, since the project itself will have to be posted inside the same Google Docs file where you have the other assignments, you can start a section there on the final project, and you can place the links there to begin with, and then you can add a comment saying, Professor, can you review these links and confirm that the stories I found are good enough for the project. Once you have the material, then you should consider the template, because what you are required to do is not write a series of short papers on the 3 short stories that you found. Rather, to process them, to catalog them according to the following section. Bibliographical references, which, if you look at the information instructions found under section number 2, should include also information about the author whenever possible. Some of the authors may not be identifiable, the story may be anonymous, or you may have the name of the author, but it's impossible to find any information about the author. The next section is a detailed synopsis of the story with an eye at the passages that involve the representation of the automobile, a short selection of relevant quotes, and the final section is the analysis. Of course, you know that you find not only instructions in here for each section, but you also find a full example applied to von Blumer's New Auto, where you can see what I did in the section called references, or what I did for the synopsis, the relevant quotes, the analysis. Okay? Going briefly through the various sections. Again, the synopsis should represent a way to offer your understanding of the story in regard to the representation of the automobile, with the inclusion of just the relevant details, with an attention to the development or the narrative arc of the characters, with the possibility of including short quotes that are significant, but not significant enough that you could include them in the next section because they're quick phrases, they're short references, or references, quotes that need a context to be understood. So, in a way, the synopsis includes analytical remarks already. It's not a simple description. For the next section of relevant quotes, the most important recommendation is that these quotes should have enough of a context to understand their relevance. That is to say, they should be such that whenever a reader, any reader, not your professor, but any reader looks at them, they understand that they have something to say about the representation of the automobile in this context. Okay? So make sure you just include the conspicuous passages, the passages where the treatment of the automobile jumps at you, is very evident that the passage is relevant, has something to offer. Finally, for the analysis, my recommendation, but it remains to be seen whether this recommendation is fully applicable to every short story, right? Because there may be so many variations in terms of how you write a short story on the automobile. But my recommendation, what I did in this case, is to consider the whole narrative and see how it compares to the narrative pattern that we discussed many times. Is there a section devoted to the anticipation before the product falls in the hands of the user and owner? Is there a section or passages devoted to the fascination with the automobile, with the seduction or rapture caused by the use of the new technology? Is there any accident that can be perceived as the loss of control by the user and the owners, and what happens at the end? Is the user owner embracing, adopting the technology? Are they rejecting it? Is the technology destroyed, which is another way to separate the characters from the technology? And if not this kind of pattern, there might be another kind of interesting pattern that you can point at in the analysis. Again, it's not a very long analysis. You can review what I did, but it's just 200 or 300 words, probably less than 300 what I did for this class, but for this, short story. But also because, as I said, I felt that during the synopsis, I had also offered enough insights about the short story itself. Now, once you start working on this, once you've identified 2 or 3 short stories and you start creating these sections, as I said earlier, you can either leave a comment or make an appointment, schedule a meeting on Zoom to review what you've done or to receive feedback, right? And then, of course, keep in mind that there are 2 relevant kinds of deadlines. One is the oral presentations, which can be booked online starting with December 12th. As an alternative, if the dates are not convenient, if you prefer, you can also share a recorded presentation with me. And so your presentations can be done from December 12th until December 19th. And in order to schedule your presentation on Zoom, you click on this link. I'm using an app called Calendly. And this is what you will find when you click on it, right? You see all the possible days. As you can see, I've also offered some hours on Saturday to make it easier for everyone to find a time that is convenient. And then when you click on a day that is good enough for you, you see all the possible times. These are the starting times, right? And I've reserved 20 minutes for the presentation, as you can see in here. Your presentation should be at least 10 minutes. If it is a little more than 10 minutes, that's fine as well. But I want to leave enough time, not only to offer my feedback, because in most instances, I'll be able to tell you, I loved your presentation, it's extraordinary, it's excellent, or I might tell you, I'll have to think about the grade for your presentation. During your presentation, I'll take a few notes. And also, sometimes there is a brief discussion that follows the presentation, because it might be a story that I've never seen. I might be curious about the story. I might be interested in your opinion on an aspect, a particular aspect of the story. So when you select a time, let's say 10 a.m., then you provide your information. And as you can see, the required fields are just first name, last name, and email. Depending, let's say you want to use a presentation, but you don't have to. In here, you might include a link to that presentation, but it's up to you. Very simply, the recommended format for the presentation via Zoom would be you open the Zoom session, we exchange niceties, and then when you're ready, you put a passage. You get the short story you want to talk about in the presentation. In the presentation, you can just talk about one of those short stories because it's 10 minutes. If you want to talk about more, then be selective, meaning don't say everything you could be saying about each story, but you could compare 2 stories by discussing select passages or scenes, but you simply put the original passage of the story up and you talk about it, and you move to another passage that is significant. Of course, you can introduce it, but it should be informal, right? It doesn't have, it's a short presentation, and the goal is for me to assess your competence, your expertise, meaning you come here to the meeting on Zoom to discuss a story that you've studied and processed for the project, and therefore something that you know in depth, you're comfortable talking about it. You don't have to be comprehensive in the treatment of your story because there is the project for that, right? And at the same time, even if you're finished the project, don't put your project on the screen because I'll be reading the project myself. For the presentation, the purpose is to see if you're able to talk freely about the story itself. So if you're more comfortable with a PowerPoint, by all means use a PowerPoint. Don't be one of those people who puts everything on the PowerPoint and proceeds to read from the slide. That's not a presentation, right? It's a modern kind of torture for viewers, for listeners, right? Same thing if you decide to record your presentation. Even there, don't read. Just talk about, do the same. You can record your own presentation with Zoom. And you can just do the same. Put some passages on the screen, talk about those passages, what you found interesting in the story, why you picked a story, what's the most telling example or scene in the story that communicates a certain idea of what kind of product the automobile is, how the automobile can be transformational for the lives of the characters in one sense or the other, because they've changed their identity once they've acquired an automobile, or they're obsessing about speed, or they're falling in love thanks to an automobile. They've accomplished the goal of finding their ideal partner thanks to the automobile, an automobile ride, an accident with the automobile. Okay, so these would be the most important points about the final project. But inside the page for the final project, you find more, right? The example, more suggestions, and of course, keep in mind that every lecture was recorded. So if you don't feel comfortable going through this page itself, you can find the videos and the chapters in those videos where I talked about the project, so you can listen to those 20 minutes or 30 minutes before you start working on the project, because everything after you listen to me would be fresh in your mind, and you can start working feeling confident that you understand the goals of the project. Okay, so this was my introduction, my summary of the basic points. Now I open the floor to all kinds of questions, small or big. Don't be shy. Okay? How can I help you with the project? Yes.
These oral presentations, they're just one-on-one?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
It would be me on Zoom and each student. I mean, if you want to invite a friend for moral support, just let me know, and then we can share the link with another person. But otherwise, it would be just you and me on that day. Of course, through the app, even after you've scheduled your presentation, you can cancel and reschedule. Okay, so once you schedule your presentation, the system Calendly will send you confirmation. Keep that confirmation email, because from there you will, in the message itself, you will find a button to cancel and reschedule. Otherwise, if you lost that confirmation message, of course, you can contact me saying, can you please cancel? And then you can reschedule using the same link. Okay, so don't worry about that. And if you want to instead send a recorded presentation, you would have until December 19th. So the last day for presentations would also be the last day to share your video recorded presentation with me. Okay?
Okay. Are those presentations supposed to be like informational, or can they be more like conversational?
It should be conversational.
Conversational.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a short presentation. So there is no need to start with an introduction or summarize everything at the end. You can very much start from the middle of things, meaning this is the most important part of the story, or this is what makes this particular story absolutely relevant for the understanding of the representation of the automobile. So you can take any angle, you can deviate, it doesn't have to be linear. It is a conversation. It is supposed to show that you are able to talk independently about the topic, that you've mastered the language and the concepts. Okay, so the grade is not dependent on how polished your presentation is, but rather how convincing your presentation is.
Okay.
Okay, and as I said, keep in mind that the presentation supplements the project. So in terms of a systematic, well-organized treatment of the story, I'll have the project to measure how well you were able to structure your analysis, etc. But in here, it would be, this is what I found interesting, and picking some of the key concepts from the class to show, since I've taken this class, using some of the guidelines, the principles introduced in the class, I can apply them to a story like this, right? What else? Other questions? Is it no questions because you're perfectly comfortable, or no questions because you're completely lost? You don't have to answer, it's a rhetorical question, but don't be shy, okay? And more importantly, it's definitely not the kind of project that you can pick up a few hours before the deadline. And probably at this point you can do all sorts of things with AI, but it might not work that well with this kind of project. Okay, so try to, and you can approach the project from a series of simple steps. Decide which stories, right? And then stop there. Go back and start with selecting some significant quotes. Then during another session, go back to the project and start working on the summary, because you can do just the first page in the story, right? These stories will be 1, 2, 3 pages at the most, right? So you can do it gradually. So you don't have really to be worried, but at the same time, you don't have to do it in a linear way, right? You can approach it as you like it. Sometimes working on a project becomes more difficult because students tend to approach this with an A through Z approach. And sometimes it's better to start with J or K in the middle somewhere, because there is something that you're sure you can talk about, you can write about. And once you've found your ground, your confidence, you can expand and make it a systematic work. Okay? Okay, so let me see. Let me introduce the film by trying to offer a different kind of schema. So I'll use the blackboard for once. So we're talking about 1971 Le Mans, same year as Traffic, the previous film. In fact, there were 5 very interesting films about the automobile that were produced and came out in the theaters, American films, in 1971. Besides Traffic, which is a French movie, there was Le Mans. Spielberg made Jewel, which was a film originally made for TV, but very, very interesting. The first film directed by Spielberg with an automobile driver pursued by a truck driver that you never see. You just see this big truck trying to kill the automobile driver. And then you have two very odd road movies. One is called Vanishing Point, and the other is called Two Lane Blacktop. All very interesting. So what is Le Mans about? Clearly, at the very center, there is a race, but around the race you find, of course, plenty of images devoted to the spectators from the very beginning, how people are converging to the racetrack and the people and how they're reacting to the race itself. And on the other side, of course, you find in general the drivers, and then we'll talk about our protagonist in particular, right? So this is the center, and these are two groups that are represented in the films, right? So the spectators are going to see a race, the drivers are going to participate in this race. What is the race about? Clearly, winning the race is relevant both for the spectators and the drivers. Both spectators and drivers are there to see what the outcome of the race will be, who will win the race. At the same time, it is very apparent through a series of episodes that will come in the next segment of the film that a race from 1970, this is when the race took place, is also about death, right? During this period, multiple race car drivers died every year. In 1966, a great film was made about Formula One called Grand Prix, and 10 Formula One drivers participated in the scenes. Better yet, it was 14 drivers participated, 14 actual drivers participated. 10 years later, 10 of them had died in different kind of accidents, in different kind of races. So the idea that you could die is very present both to spectators and to drivers. So for the spectators, you have the emotion associated with the victory itself, right? This emotion is delayed. When you go see a race, there is a lot of waiting, but eventually you have the outcome, you have a winner. And in reference to the possibility of a lethal accident, of course, there is tension, and the tension can be mounting because it's a long race, 24-hour, and associated with that, you have the possibility, in this case, the release of the emotions after a long wait. Finally, after 24 hours, a team, a car, a crew has won, and with tension, there is the mounting of the tension, which can become drama, right? And the associated emotions if there is indeed a serious accident. For the drivers, of course, their connection to winning is their desire, or better yet, their ambition, right? The drivers, the top drivers are there to win the race. And in reference to death, of course, you can talk about fear, right? Even now, there is the possibility of a deadly accident. So a driver may be more afraid, less afraid, but no one is completely neutral about the eventuality of death. Because it still happens, not as much as it did in the past, but there are still people dying in the races. Of course, in reference to the desire and ambition, you find all kinds of themes associated with that, right? Whether the car is competitive enough, whether the driver is fast enough, the relationship and competition with the adversaries on the track. In reference to fear, there is the issue of preparing for the race, and right, you see the drivers getting ready for the race, not just putting on their garbs, but also getting ready mentally, finding the focus, right, to race in spite of the possibility of death. Now, we can repeat the same kind of schema in reference to the protagonists. So, for the spectators, what the film picks selectively to represent a more significant story is Lisa. Lisa is the widow of Piero Belghetti, who died in an accident that involved also Michael Delaney's car. Lisa's husband Piero died. Michael survived, although he was seriously injured. So Lisa has come to see the race. And what we did here is to explain why spectators go to a race, to feel the emotion connected to winning, to the victory, the resolution of the race, to feel the tension connected to the possibility of a dramatic accident. We are trying to explain here why the drivers came to the race with the ambition to win, with some fear that this could be the end of their life and their career. So in this case, we have Michael and Lisa coming to the race. And here too, we can talk about death. Because clearly Piero died the year earlier, and Michael himself could die, and in fact he will have, as we will see shortly, a very serious accident. So this becomes much more personal as a possibility, the possibility of death. And in the case of Lisa, in reference to death, there is tension because she's not completely sure she's come to the same place where her husband died. Why? We don't know. She doesn't really explain why. We can only guess, which is in the nature of these films more heavily based on visual storytelling. For one thing, she's part of the circus. She's part of this kind of social environment. She knows the people in the Ferrari team. She knows the drivers. So in many ways, this is also her social circle. But certainly there is tension caused by the memories of her husband's death. There is tension in reference to Michael because Michael may have been responsible for the accident where Piero died. It's not clear. She's not openly blaming Michael, but at the same time, this tension in terms of emotions is certainly coupled with guilt. It's clear, even though they don't speak to each other a lot in the first part of the film, they speak more to each other in the second part of the film, but there is some awkwardness, right? Because they haven't cleared the air. They haven't fully, openly discussed whether Michael himself feels guilty or is guilty about Piero's accident, or is it just a racing accident because races are dangerous by itself. And so is Lisa there to see who will win the race? No, clearly, right? She's not interested in the outcome of the race. But we could talk in reference to both characters about some kind of personal victory, right? Some kind of personal goal or resolution that they're seeking. So probably we could say, probably because we don't find the script to support our interpretation, but we could say Lisa is there to go over the deaths of her husband and remain part of that social circle, meaning her personal victory would be to be able to absorb the trauma of the loss of her husband and still remain in that kind of social sector, which is racing, where she has a place because she knows people. And for Michael is not there to win. Of course he would like to win the race, but it's not his primary goal, as we will see more and more through the race. His primary goal is to find his confidence. And he needs confidence in two areas. One is racing, right? Because he himself feels guilty, right? So we can add guilt in here as well. He feels guilty about his potential responsibility in the accident with Piero. And what the accident with Piero left in Michael is not just a traumatic memory, right? I'm racing and from 1 second to the next, my car could be crashing. More than that is the fact that Michael feels guilty about racing competitively, which during that time especially meant racing aggressively. So he's afraid, he has to find his confidence because he's afraid that if he races hard, aggressively, somebody else might die like Piero did. And in fact, the sign that Michael has found his confidence and achieved his personal victory will be that at the very end, not only he will be responsible for the victory of his team. He doesn't win, but somebody else in his team wins, but he protects the lead position of a team colleague by bumping several times into a Ferrari, which could have passed both of those Porsches. So he's confident enough in his driving style at the end of the film that he can drive hard, race aggressively without being afraid of killing someone. In reference to confidence, of course, there is also the relationship with Lisa. Clearly, there is some romantic tension between these two, but Michael doesn't feel fully confident because how can you approach someone whose husband died in an accident where your car was involved, right? How do you establish a relationship? And Lisa, at some point, will make Michael understand that she would be willing to explore a relationship, but not with death in the middle. Only if Michael is willing to give up on racing, because she cannot afford emotionally to get close to another individual and lose that individual as well because of an accident. So in here we can put fear as well. But Michael is not afraid of dying. Keep that in mind, because Steve McQueen wanted Michael to be the cool guy, right? Michael is not afraid of dying. He's afraid of killing someone else in an accident. And therefore, he's not driving at his full potential. And Michael is afraid to approach Lisa openly. Or if you want, afraid to commit, because no matter how close he might feel to Lisa, is afraid of leaving racing behind to pursue this relationship. Okay? So this was my effort to make this film with very limited dialogue more understandable. And now we go back to the actual film